Hebrew Matthew was discovered by this professor named George Howard in the 1980s. As far as I know, he passed away. And it's really interesting. So I actually recently met the publisher of this book. And I met him at a conference, and I said, "Oh, you're the guy who publishes this book." And I told him who I was, and he says, "You have no idea how much trouble you've caused us. They publish dozens and dozens of books, and they have one book that people call up and yell at them." And they call up and they yell and they talk to the poor people on the phone who don't know anything about this. They're like, working in the fulfillment department, and they say, "Why does it say in there what it says in the English? It's not what it says in the Hebrew." And they're like, "Whoa, we just fulfill orders. We don't know what you're talking about." And so I want to give credit and honor to George Howard. What he did was brilliant, groundbreaking work. Mm-hmm. But he was working, first of all, with 9 manuscripts. And he was starting out...
Nine Hebrew manuscripts.
9 Hebrew manuscripts. Today we know of 28 manuscripts.
Wait, ladies and gentlemen, why there are 28 is because Nehemia has traveled the world. He's gotten into archives. He has found these things over, what is it, the last 14 years?
No, even longer than that. Most of those I discovered probably by around 2005. There were a couple more I discovered after that. But you have no idea what painstaking work it was, Michael. I looked through hundreds of manuscripts searching for this exact text. And most of them had nothing to do with Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. Most of them were, completely unrelated texts. But the only way to know that was to check them and study them. And just to give you an idea, I was looking through archives where in the catalog it would say something like, Jewish polemical work, which means it's some kind of dialogue between Jews and Christians. It could be this, it could be something else. Most of the time it was something else. But I had no idea, or it would say collection of Jewish works. Well, that could be anything, right? I looked through hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts in order to identify 28. There could be more, actually. I would be shocked if there are not more than 28. But right now I currently know of 28.
Now 28.
Right. And so, for example, so he knew about 9 of them. And then the part of the problem is when he went to translate the texts he had, he was really coming from the perspective of a New Testament professor, deep in the Greek text. And you'll see he'll put words in parentheses. And nowhere in the book does he explain what those parentheses are. But what the parentheses represent is, I decided not to translate what's in the Hebrew text. I decided to translate what it says in the Greek. Well, then why did you bother? And if you look at this, I don't know if they can open up and see it. So he's got the Hebrew on one side, and he has the the English on the other. And I read the Hebrew. I can read the Hebrew without any problem. Az halach echad me'ashnei masar shmo Yehuda Iscarioto. It's about Judas Iscariot. Ligdolei HaKohanim. So if you can read the Hebrew, it's no problem. If you look at the English, and you all of a sudden see these words in parentheses, and you're like, okay, well, why is that different? And so the problem is the words in parentheses are what the Greek says. And really, if we're honest, the words in parentheses are what Howard wanted the text to say, not what it said. And I'm actually currently working on the 28 manuscripts, and it's a problem. Because sometimes you come to a passage and you read what it says in the manuscript and you say, well, that doesn't make any sense. I should just translate what the Greek says because it makes so much more sense. And then, sometimes I'll discuss it with especially somebody coming from a New Testament perspective, with a Christian, a Messianic, and he'll say, well, don't you see, Nehemia, what this means? No, tell me. Oh, wow. And you see what the Hebrew says is amazing, and you completely missed it because you're so coming from, here's what we expect the text to say, and it doesn't say that, so you want to gloss over it. It's really difficult. And so I'm working on this project currently. I've been working on it for years. And I have this person who's I bounce ideas off. And he says, Nehemia, you're being George Howard. And I'm like, what do you mean? He says, you're translating what you want it to say, not what it says. And I'm like, oh, you're right. And it's really hard.
Oh, yeah.
It's not easy. I give him a lot of credit, but there's amazing things in there when you look at the Hebrew text.
If you can give us a little bit of background, why we have these different manuscripts, why do they read differently, and why isn't there just one monolith, this is the Hebrew Matthew?
Well, so you had Jewish rabbis who were copying this book in secret. It was you have to understand, it was illegal for a Jew to own a copy of the New Testament. Jews were accused of doing the worst things. They were accused of breaking into the Catholic churches and kidnapping the wafer, the Eucharist, and sticking pins in it to torture the body of Christ. And so if a Jew was found to own a copy of the New Testament, the entire Jewish community could be persecuted. So when you're doing these things in secret, it creates all kinds of limitations where you can't openly send it to another rabbi and say, hey, check out and make sure I copied this right. You can't do that. Like what they did with the Old Testament is they'd travel across the world to check their Bibles. They were really limited and they had to do it really in secret. And then sometimes they'd say, uh-oh, that's different than what I was told the Greek text says. And if the Christians find out that my Hebrew text is different than the Greek, we might be killed for this if they find out. So we better correct it to the Greek. So you have these processes going on.
There it is, corrected according to the Greek.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things George Howard, one of the brilliant discoverers, is he finds over time as the manuscripts develop, they become more and more like the Greek. So the earliest ones and the most authentic ones are you read them and you're like, there's no way this was translated from Greek. This is not what a Greek translation sounds like in Hebrew. And then you read some of the other ones and you're like, okay, they fixed this and made it more Greek. And I understand now that I'm working on it, how tempting that is. Because you're like, well, that's not what it's supposed to say. Well, who says? The Greek says that. And it's such an exciting process of what's going on there. He began the process, this man, George Howard, and we're living in such exciting times where the process is continuing.